A former educator specializing in history, political science, and public policy, Paulette Buchanan has been fighting for her own truth and justice. Her message can be found in her book, Fighting for Justice, Religious Fraud, Mental Illness, and the Collapse of Law and Order, which also stems from her own family experience. She has been stalked by her brother, a cult leader who weaponized the court system against her through multiple meritless lawsuits against her and her husband. Today, she has permanent injunctions and judgments against him. These experiences have her working with legislators to propose bills and pass into law restrictions against abusive litigants. Her goal is to inform the public and policymakers of the issues of court reform, cults and religious fraud, mental illness, policy reform, and government corruption. Welcome, Paulette. It's so good to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me, Debbie. I appreciate your time.
So that is one quite the story. I don't know how much detail you can go into, but can you share how long this battle has been going on for you?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes people have asked me, what are the origins of this? Where did this begin? And so I asked them really from the time I was born, possibly even really before I was born. I am the only girl of four older brothers. And really from the get-go, they basically treated me as the intruder. Um, my mother explained to me, especially as she got older, people tend to be more reflective, that they had issues with themselves and with their peers even before I was born. I sort of discussed that whole idea of nature versus nurture in my book. And I think that my brothers definitely exhibited some mental health problems very early on in their own development as children. And of course, that just worsened. There wasn't a lot of mental health help back then in the 50s and 60s. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 61, very end of 61. And it really has its origin back then, that far, that as we all reflect on our lives, we say, how did this happen? And I look at different things and with a new perspective, with an adult perspective, looking back, it's like, wow, that was so aberrant. That was so unhealthy. And the relationships there. And I was in the right to feel angry, to feel betrayed, to feel even violated, you know?
I just finished the Netflix documentary "Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey" by about Warren Jeffs, and it seems really like there's a lot more cults than we realize.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how easy do you think it is for people to kind of get ensnared in a cult?
It's extremely easy. And there are a few different factors going into it. I think the collapse of the family unit has gone a lot into that. The betrayal of the church leaders. There are some very good pastors out there, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and they are just as floored and offended and outraged at all of this, that their own peers did so much violence to people, so much betrayal of trust. It's what I call in my chapter, raping and slaughtering souls, because that's what they do. They are soul rapists. They are soul slaughterers. But when you combine all those factors with the fact that the family unit has been in decline, that you bring the internet into it, where you get a lot of lonely people, a lot of insecure people, and they get sucked into these online things, which, they're only seeing a certain part of this. And people like my brother can get out there internationally. He has international followers. And they can portray themselves in a way that there's very little way to find out the truth about who these people are. And, as we always say in the whole cult healing atmosphere of, different people that I've been with when we deal with cult issues, is that no one wakes up any given morning and says, oh, I think I'm going to screw up my life and join a cult. Nobody says that. One account I remember hearing was a woman, she was going through a very bad patch with relationships, with her job. She was in a low point in her life. That's the problem. She was standing in line in a supermarket, and she happened to look at, one of the tabloid magazines, whatever they have there. And it talked about trying to find meaning and purpose in your life, Well, standing right behind her by chance happened to be a person who was in a cult. It was sort of a self-improvement meditative cult. It wasn't really a religious one per se. There was kind of an element of spirituality to it. It's this enormous, horrible woman who ran this thing under the guise of being like a psychotherapist and everything else. So it's not just religious cults. There are political cults. There are self-improvement cults. That whole NXIVM thing was a self-improvement cult, basically. But this woman starts striking up a conversation with this woman that was relating how she was in a bad point in her life. And the next thing she knows, she's being little by little lured in to attending the meetings, to swallowing some of the propaganda. They know these cult people who start these cults and who get their henchmen for them. They're oftentimes experts in human behavior. They can read people so well, and they hit upon the vulnerable. And, whether it's a knock on your door or whether it's a random meeting in a supermarket, whatever it may be, they're on the hunt for people. And no matter what your religious background is, no matter what your particular personal background is, you have to be on your guard against people like that. And as I said, there are political cults on both sides, very left, very right. You can get these political cults that are just, it's one given way, and they will not listen to the other side. They will not reason things out or rationalize things. My background is in history and political science, public policy. And I used to warn my students, anybody who's going to claim to you that they have all the answers is lying to you. Okay, we're all in this boat together, and we're all going to try to do the best we can. But when you get down to people who are basically hungry for power and control over others, that's where the danger lies. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Hitler or a Mao Zedong or a Mussolini or an Idi Amin or a James or Jim Jones type of thing. You're going to get people that's the only thing they're interested in is power and control. And that's one of the big key issues, is that if they start little by little chipping away at your self-confidence, listen to the gut feeling that says, who are they to tell me that? Like, when did God drop dead and leave them in charge? And a lot of it has to do with your own sense of worth, your own sense of value on this earth. I mean, I do believe in a higher power. I believe in God. I believe that we have an afterlife. And I try to live accordingly. Not perfect means, but I try to treat people the way I want to be treated. I mean, isn't that a universal thing? Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Don't do to other people what you don't want someone doing to you. I mean, it's a very basic thing. I think if more of us lived like that, we wouldn't have all these problems. It's very simple, but yet seemingly complex.
So true. You mentioned your other brothers made your life miserable as well, but did you and do you now have any support from family?
I do have some cousins who are supportive. Some of them have gone through some things too, not really related to my brothers. Some of them have, because the one brother is an expert hacker. And for example, he hacked into email servers. He, read their emails and things like that. Things of that nature. He hacked into our email server to find them. And he hacked into things like, I was on ancestry.com. That's how I got to know some of my other distant cousins. And he hacked into their things. And as his hacking war prize, I had sent them unique family photos that I know they did not have copies of. And the next thing I know, we're getting word from one of our friends that he is posting those on his Facebook page. So that was his hacking reward, to say, see what I did. Yeah, it's like I said, it's all about power and control. Yep.
So, weren't you afraid when you wrote your book? Were you thinking maybe you might have to write it under a pseudonym?
No. And the reason why, first of all, I think my personality is I've always been a fighter. From my earliest days, my mother told me that before I could even talk, and they would, pinch me, shove me, whatever. I was just basically a toddler. I would basically yell at them in my own language. I'm basically just scream at them. I've always been a fighter. And I think they've always resented me for that because I've always been a fighter. Women aren't supposed to fight. You know that. We're just supposed to just suck it up and take it. And it's like, no, not going to happen. And so I was not afraid to write the truth. And I encourage anybody else. I know, Debbie, you told me about your situation too. I encourage anybody else, especially in the case of my brother, who's a public figure. He gets himself out there advertising himself as a professional photographer, as a ministry leader. He has no financial accountability for any of that. So he's breaking the law in regards to that. But as attorneys first told us, and one right after another in this state and other states that we lived in the state where my brother lives in, they told us, look, this guy is what's called a limited purpose public figure. He is expressing opinions. He is in trying to persuade people in a certain way on both the religious issue and on political issues. He's also advertising himself, offering business services. You have a right to name him. You have a right to use public records against him because he has police records, court records against him. And you have a right to do that. So, and some of the lawyers would just about blow up and say, if anybody did this to me, I'd really go after him. And they said the other alternative is defamation lawsuit. But the problem is you have to really go through an extraordinary amount to prove your case. And it's ridiculous. But I mean, defamation is defamation. It's kind of like pornography. You know what it is. So I was not at all afraid. I had been through, at that point, let's see, 9 lawsuits. Yeah, by that time that I got my book published, 9 lawsuits. And he had sued other people, his ex-wife, her husband, a church that he once belonged to. He's probably sued other people that I know of because our court system's broken. A previous generation of judges, again, it doesn't matter what political spectrum they belong to, they had more respect for the courts. They would have never allowed someone knowingly to harass people and weaponize the court system. They would have thrown those lawsuits out in a heartbeat. I have talked to a few judges in the state where I'm living now. I'm living in Tennessee. Clearly, I do not have a Tennessee accent. But we have been told actually by judges here, if anything from your brother crosses my desk, just like I do with some other really crazy lawsuits that like right on the face of it, you could tell they're nuts. I'm going to do what my duty and responsibility is as a judge, and I'm throwing it out right there on the spot. And that's what judges are supposed to do. They have the right and the responsibility, the duty to be court managers, to not allow the courts to be weaponized. And we've heard from some attorneys that, because again, judges are attorneys, that they don't care. They want to help their fellow attorneys by having representation given to victims. But I mean, we're out a lot of money, even though we have the judgments. Trying to collect on that is a real pain in the backside. But no, I'm not at all afraid to speak out. And I've talked to other people in my situation who are very similar to it, where cults especially have sued. They frequently use the court system in the same way. They weaponize it. But they've said, you know what, go ahead and sue me. I'm telling the truth. And even one person I talked to, he's been sued by different cults, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And he said, he used the same lawyer, I believe, in all those cases. And the lawyer said to him, there are 3 important things I want you to remember when you testify. 1, tell the truth. 2, tell the truth. 3, tell the truth, because the truth is on your side. And so I always tell victims, hey, if the truth is on your side, speak it. And especially if these people who are doing this to you are public figures, they're running cults, they're trying to get the public trust, then you have a right to name them. And if they're smearing your name in order to, like my brother, try to get victim status, I mean, we've been harassed by his cult followers because they believed hook, line, and sinker that I'm a child abuser, I'm a domestic terrorist, I'm a wanted criminal. I've never been any of those things. And so I tell people, you have a right to defend yourself. You have a right to speak the truth. You have value, you have worth. And that's one of the things that cults do to people is they chip away, they replace God in people's lives, whether it's a political God or a religious God, they replace that God hole by saying, you need to listen to me because I know more. And they try to come across as compassionate sometimes. They use every trick in the book. And you just have to be very, very careful about the people that are out there. But it is an enormous problem. And I think the internet is feeding that. A lot of very empty souls out there. And you're never going to find meaning by listening to a complete stranger on the internet and trusting them. You know, I believe in my book, I even have, and I've told people before, don't believe a word I'm saying. Check it out. You know, I'm not God, you know, but you've got to check out the facts yourself. Be very scrutinizing. As much as emotionally you may want to say, oh, wow, I really identify with that person, or I really believe in what they're saying. Remember that power-hungry people they're experts in human behavior, and they will use whatever it takes to lure their followers in.
Wow. Well, how have those frivolous lawsuits and all of this mess affected you personally? And I imagine financially and the time, I just can't imagine. I know for me, myself personally, I really didn't have the funds to fight. So I just never mentioned his name and just let him have at her and do whatever the hell he wanted to do, and just went on and lived my life, even though I knew that was still back there. But how on earth have you done this?
Well, it's been extremely difficult. We have spent about $200,000 in legal fees. He actually did publicly admit that the only reason he knows he's going to lose these lawsuits, the only reason he has filed them is to cost us attorney fees. And so he has freely admitted that's his only motivation. He did it to his ex-wife too. There are certain victims of abusive lawsuits like this. It's called stalking through the courts for a reason. And shame on those judges that are allowing it to happen. It happens, like we mentioned before, in all English law countries, like the United States, like Canada, UK, obviously, Australia, New Zealand. Those are prominently where you have an uptick in abusive litigation filed by self-represented or pro se litigants. They know the system's broken. They know that judges are by and large very apathetic. And shame on them for being that way. It's kind of ironic, really. A lot of attorneys, when they see how aggressive a pro se litigant can be, we've had attorneys say, I can't take your case because what if he comes after me and my family?
Oh,
but
God.
yes, it's devastating. So you have to go searching for a conscientious attorney. We have had some bad attorneys. We got 2 fired. We've had one really bad judge we had reprimanded. But as I said, I'm a fighter. And when he sued us, you can't ignore a lawsuit, for one thing. You can't just say, oh, well, you know, surely the judge will see how ridiculous this is. No, they will get a default judgment against you. They can attach your wages. They can slam down your bank accounts. I mean, you know, they can do a lot of damage if you don't respond to a lawsuit. You have to respond to it. Most of them, we responded with attorneys. I'm thankful my husband makes a very good salary, that at one point in time I did as well. But who wants to spend their money basically proving 1 + 1 is 2 to one judge after another? And we kept trying to fight against it. We left Connecticut because the court system there is utterly corrupt. He actually forged a judge's signature. We notified the court about it. They did nothing.
Wow.
We also had a very bad attorney at that time too. And again, eventually we got him fired. And the senior attorney took over the case and got the whole case shut down within a couple of months. But it's been a nightmare because it's a sad thing when you know more about the law than your attorney does. And it's a pretty good indication you need to get rid of them. But yeah, I never wanted to learn about the legal system the way it's been. And even our own attorneys, the good ones, have said, yeah, the system's broken. And we said, no, it was made broken. It needs to be fixed by the very people who broke it. The judges need to put their foot down on stuff like this and stop allowing this nonsense to clog up the court system. This is basically like a bunch of backed up sewage that they've caused, and they need to flush it out. So yes, it's been extremely exhausting. There were days I didn't even want to wake up in the morning because these court cases drag on and drag on and drag on and drag on. And then, of course, usually the tactics of a pro se litigant, especially one like my brother, is that they file all these ape crap crazy motions and continuances. And so just when you think like the Friday before a Monday hearing, he would file, oh, I'm a continuance. Oh, I'm so sick, I can't come in. And, fortunately here in Tennessee, the judge said, no, too bad. Unless you got a doctor's note, no, too bad. And then
they keep firing their attorney as well to delay the case.
They can do that. If they're not filing pro se, they can, if they do get an attorney and they've lied to them, they can keep rehiring new attorneys, lying to them, of course. So there's that. If they actually hire attorneys, the most stalkers through the courts, they do it pro se. They never hire an attorney. So we actually have the injunctions now finally against him, state and federal injunctions, where he has to get the court to approve it. He has to have an attorney, and that attorney has to file an affidavit saying, yes, he actually has a valid case, which, I mean, snowball's chance in hell that's going to happen. So, I mean, we finally have these injunctions. But yes, we have I think it's like $247,000 in judgments against him. But he lied to get disability. We reported that. The government did nothing. We had proof, like concrete proof, and the government did nothing. And then now he's getting Social Security. You cannot access that for garnishment. We know he's making a boatload of money under the table through his scam ministry and any scam businesses. He has 9 email accounts, or has had, that have variations of kid sex in them. So he's probably making a boatload of money on child porn. I don't know what else even our own attorneys have said, this looks bad. We've notified the police. We've notified the FBI. If the police who say, yeah, it does look bad, but we can't do anything, we'd have to convince a judge that it looks bad. Well, it's like, in order to graduate law school and pass the bar, do you have to lobotomize yourself of a conscience? We're talking about children here, So, I don't know why else anybody would set up 9 email accounts that have variations of the word kid sex in them, other than for doing something very horribly evil to children. I don't know why else anybody would do that. So I can't say conclusively, oh, yes, he's doing child porn. But I know that child porn is extremely lucrative. He does make money under the table. And he takes trips overseas. He takes trips domestically, all of that. And yet at the same time, he'll file with the court to say, oh, I'm bedridden. I can't move. Or I'm taking care of my bedridden wife. And the court buys it. The federal courts especially, they don't really care. The courts themselves do not uphold the law when, for example, we had a state injunction against him. The federal courts oftentimes look down on the state courts and they just ignore them. And it's like, excuse me, we have this wonderful document. It has some deficiencies in it, but nonetheless, it's a pretty good document. It's called the U.S. Constitution. And you as a judge have the responsibility and right, and we have the right, for full faith and credit, that when one court in our state issues a judgment against him, they're not in some banana republic. They are another state court. They are part of our government, and you have to acknowledge that. And unfortunately, we get rogue judges who do quite literally whatever the hell they feel like doing, regardless of the facts right there in front of them. And it's very frustrating. It's frustrating for our attorneys because they've said, I'd love to be a judge myself. I could correct this, but there's a bunch of backslapping and good old boy and good old girl systems going on that prevent good attorneys from becoming good judges. It's basically who you know, who you schmooze with, and everything. It's a troublesome system, and unfortunately, victims end up paying for it. It's extremely unfair to victims. And the judges, most of them, not all of them, but too many of them just don't care.
Is there hope for change in that? Is there any kind of reform that could be done?
We're working for that. We are trying very hard to work with our legislature, but even our legislators are saying that for example, the Trial Lawyers Association, we're trying to get laws passed here in Tennessee that are very similar to like Florida, Texas, California, where you have an abusive litigant list. You have a bond requirement where you can approach the judge as soon as the abusive litigant serves you, so you know you're being sued. You can then file something with the judge to say, this person we are going to convince you this is an abusive litigant. You need to consider that this is an abusive lawsuit. So what you can do, Judge, is you can impose a bond requirement where that bond requirement will pay our attorney fees in the end. And if they don't pay it up front, if the abusive litigant does not pay the bond requirement, their case gets dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot refile that case against you. And again, states like Florida, Texas, California, blue-red states have passed these laws because they recognize what a horrible problem abusive litigants are doing, not only to victims, but really to the court system. Very, very expensive. It delays legitimate cases, and they've taken steps to do that. Now, in 2018, we were able to get, we contacted our legislator, and there was already some other victims who had spoken up, and Tennessee passed the abusive civil action law. And we used that law to get our first judgment and injunction against my brother. Problem is, he lives in another state, so we couldn't extradite him. They're not going to put out the money to extradite him when he violated that injunction by continuing to file legal actions against us, both in Connecticut, where we hadn't lived in so many years, and in Georgia, where he lives. But we were finally able to get things domesticated in Georgia and all that stuff. And the other courts state courts recognized our Tennessee judgment and injunction and granted that to dismiss his lawsuits. But again, we had to hire our attorneys to say, hey, you need to argue this. So there is some progress, but we are really being held up by the Trial Lawyers Association. Here in Tennessee, there's a thing called the Administrative Office of the Courts, and they don't believe they're beholden to anybody. The whole point of the United States was the three branches of government having an equal amount of power as a check and a balance. And yet, unfortunately, the judiciary is exerting, in some cases, way more power than they were ever supposed to have by a constitutional law. I mean, if you have a written constitution, if you don't like it, amend it. Don't just violate it. I mean, it's like a stop sign. It's like, well, I don't like the color of it. I think I'll run it. No, it's a stop sign. It's there for a reason, So we are running up against a powerful group of special interest group of Trial Lawyers Association and the Administrative Office of the Courts. And so actually the Tennessee Bar Association liaison between the Tennessee Bar Association and the legislature has told us, write directly to the judges, which we are going to be doing in November. There are going to be new judges that are going to be elected here in the state of Tennessee. Judges are elected. Some are appointed, but some are elected. And we're going to be writing them to say, you have a duty and a responsibility to review these lawsuits. That was the other thing, was judicial review. In the Latin term, it's called sua sponte decisions, where they can get something filed. The court clerk can say, get a load of this one. The judge can look at it and say, nope, this is completely without merit. It doesn't have a legal standing to pursue a claim. It doesn't have anything. And so they can dismiss it right there on the spot, like a previous generation of judges used to do. And it's very frustrating. So that our legislator, he has said, yeah, this is really frustrating because I'm doing everything I can, but unfortunately, the courts are going to do whatever they feel like doing. And, our response has been, there is a check and balance. I mean, at some point, you have to try to pursue what is simply best, take it to a vote in the legislature, and tell the judges, suck it. I mean, because you have to do what you have to do. If you don't like it, appeal it, to a federal court, a higher court. But don't just ignore a law that's written, So it's extremely frustrating. Many, many good laws down through the years in many different countries. And think of the abolition of slavery in England. It happened there before it happened in the United States. But it took an excruciatingly long time and a lot of painful efforts, a lot of really hard efforts to get that going. You think of any good law that's been passed. I can give you some examples of marriage eligibility laws where you have the age of consent, you have the age of when somebody can get married. Fortunately, in this a number of blue and red states, conservative and liberal states, they've been passing laws that say, you know what, you can't marry a 13-year-old. I don't care if you do have parental consent, you can't marry a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. In some cases, they have it where somebody wants to marry somebody, they have to go before a judge to find out, are you entering into this marriage of your own free will to like a 16-year-old?
They should do that for every age.
Yeah, I know. Cults do that, though. They oftentimes shove people into arranged marriages. Abusive parents. We've heard of situations where you get a 13 or 14-year-old girl and her 27-year-old boyfriend is wanting to, quote unquote, marry her because he's been raping her, statutory rape. And hey, as long as he gives the parents or the parent, a big caseload of beer, they'll sign off and say, yes, I consent to you marrying my daughter. So there are good laws that are passed about this. The other one has to do with sex abuse cases. That's the statute of limitations, extending the statute of limitations. Again, these are laws that have been taking years and years. I think the whole pre-scandal and the Boy Scout scandal have really pushed it to the fore to say, look, many of these victims were children. They're not going to come out with this stuff until they're in their 20s or 30s. They need to have a voice. These were criminal actions that were done against them, and they were too traumatized to even know what to do with it. They didn't have the mental and emotional capability to know how to handle this. They were children. And so there have been a number of states that have passed these laws. Any good law, though, oftentimes, it takes a long time to get going, especially if you're fighting very powerful special interest groups.
That is a really, really good point. And I really thank you for sharing that, because it isn't an easy fix, but if it's worth the fight, you have to keep it going. And then even if it continues through generations.
Yep.
Voting is another one.
Women's rights.
That long ago when women couldn't vote.
Yeah. And they got it in England before they got it here in America. And one of the primary reasons I teach my classes this is that women fought in World War I. Well, the Great War, as it was known. And they said, if we're going to be fighting in wars, why don't we have a voice to say, maybe we shouldn't be going into war, or maybe we should be doing things a little better. Maybe we should be using more diplomacy, or maybe we'll be building up more armaments. We can fight somebody like a nut job like Hitler coming to power. He was coming to power very early in the 20s, and people knew about it. And women, it's interesting because, our second president, John Adams, his wife said, if women don't get the vote, this is back in the 1700s, and early 1800s. She said, if Abigail Adams, if we don't get the vote, we're going to rebel. We're going to have our own revolution. So, needless to say, she couldn't quite muster up the support for that. But good for you, Abigail.
We've had to continue that revolution for centuries.
Yeah, exactly. It took a long time. Well, it's interesting. I used to tell, and I don't know what it was like in the Canadian provinces, but as territories were grabbed up out west and states, or I should say before they even became states, our Western territories, in order to have enough votes, they allowed the women to vote in those Western territories back in the 1800s. So it was like, there is precedent for this, and women have a brain. We do use it, and we use it sometimes better than men. Sometimes not so much, but yeah, when it came to expediency, political expediency, they gave women the vote in those Western territories. So again, any good law like this, where you're fighting very powerful interest groups, just keep plugging away at it. And like you said, it could take generations.
Wow. So, what do you want your readers and the public to know that might empower them to achieve positive change, other than keep fighting?
Well, part of it is keeping fighting, unfortunately. But
Yes.
yeah, to keep speaking up, um, to really don't be a pest, but treat your legislator with some degree of respect, whether they are a Republican or a Democrat, depending on what it is. I mean, we worked with a Democrat legislator, representative in Connecticut. She was very sympathetic. I really am trying to push bipartisanship and working together. I kind of make a little quip in my book about, I wish we had more like a Ronald Reagan and a Tip O'Neill working together, even though they really did not agree on some important issues. They still agreed enough to say, we got to work for the better of our society, our local government, our state government, our federal government. We've got to work for the betterment of our society. And stop this whole thing, the enemy, we've got to listen to each other and everything, as hard as that can be sometimes. But we have to speak up against clear and obvious wrongs. I think about child trafficking. I mean, it is such a horrible thing when these kids are it's a worldwide problem, when these kids are being transported. A lot of our kidnapping cases, they're finding kids have been trafficked, sex trafficked. And it's a horrible thing to do to a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 17-year-old. There are actual child trafficking, you can call them cults if you want to. Sometimes they use a religious snag.
Yeah.
They stalk on college campuses. And you think about when somebody goes off to college, they're right out of high school, they've lost all their base of support with their friends. Yeah, they can get on Facebook or whatever, and they can, text them, Skype them and all, whatever they do. But it's not the same thing as being there. And unfortunately, there can be some rather destructive forces on college campuses that can snare these people into thinking, oh, you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we've got such a wonderful program. You really need to leave this university, and your parents are holding you back, and your friends are holding you back, and we're going to help you develop into like this wonderful human being. And they just use every deceptive trick in the book. We've got to speak up against these things.
Yeah.
I think colleges need to do more. Some of these cults go into nursing homes, and they get people to change their wills to bequeath everything over to the cult and the cult leader and all that. So we just have to keep being very careful out there, especially when it comes to anything on the internet. Check everything out. But really, when somebody goes through something very traumatic and devastating, like I talk about how you can battle with all kinds of different emotions and stuff. You can just be so beaten down. And in some other podcasts that I've been on, we talk about even a person where you're somewhat mentally stable. You can have those fleeting millisecond suicidal thoughts. They're dark thoughts, and because you just want to escape. And I've told myself, I shake myself. It's like, no, I'm not going to give my abuser that power. That's what they want me to do. They want me to destroy myself. They want to see me destroyed. And I will not give that to them. And the same thing with spiritual suicide. I talk about with people losing their faith. And it's like, you cannot let them do that. You cannot let this person define who the Almighty is or what your morals are going to be. You cannot let this person make you feel like sludge and dictate to you and control who you are as an individual and your reasoning and your rationality. You cannot let them do that to you. They cannot replace God in your life. And I'm really trying to get people to speak up, to get involved in their communities, and really to work outside of it can be so easy to get involved with what you're going through. Reach out of yourself. I've been doing volunteer work, oh my goodness, since my teen years. And I have to say, there have been days when it's like, I'm angry at the Almighty. I'm so just ripping mad at everything, I feel so discouraged. And I say, you know what? There's a whole world out there. There's a beautiful bird singing. I'm going to be grateful of all the good things I have, even though I've got this horrible thing happening where, I don't know if my brother's going to shoot me up with his AR-15. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's like, you know what? If that's happening, then I'm going to die a good death. I'm going to be doing something doing, if it's in the parking lot of where I do volunteer work or whatever, I'm going to live my life. I'm not going to live in fear. I'm not going to. And I really had to work through the issue. And yes, we had some good therapists who they also had other clients who were going through stalking. And so we were kind of like swapping ideas around that they would then pass on to, their clients. And sometimes those clients would pass things on through the therapist to us. It wasn't like a group therapy thing or anything. It was done very discreetly. And you have to make sure, though, you're talking about your issues. You find out who your friends are when you go through something like this.
No shit.
Yeah, you really do. You find
and
out
your family too.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've said it for so many years, decades. I've said it. If they don't act like family, I'm not going to acknowledge them as family. But yeah, you have to definitely have a good base of support. Any type of difficulty you go through. I've known people have gone through like horrible cancer. You find out who your friends are when you go through a difficult patch in life. And especially if it's a long-term patch, you find out who your friends are, and you find out who the ones that they can't deal with it for whatever reason. Sometimes you can't be too harsh on them because they're going through their own boatload of crap. So you have to really just find your good base of support, and, don't overload them because there's only so much they can deal with. It seems like everybody's going through something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you've got to be kind to yourself. You've got to be compassionate to yourself, and you have to like reach out of yourself and help other people, because the least little thing, if it's a cashier at one of the stores, and you can tell they're just having a crappy day, a horrible day, and a smile, kind word, and it can lift their spirits. We just have so many bad things happening in the world. I don't want to contribute to that. And I'm not perfect. Again, as I mentioned, my father's family comes from New York City, and sometimes I'm a little too blunt. Someone's acting like a jerk in public. I will say, it's like, really? You really want to go down that way? And, especially here in the South, where they tend to talk, behind people's back, and they'll say, they'll say things, they always say, bless her heart, or bless his heart or something. They'll say, well, he's a real scuzzbag, bless his heart. Whereas,
Yeah.
a Yankee like myself will say, well, he's a real scuzzbag. We don't do the bless his heart thing. Okay. I mean, we lay all the cards out on the table, so, but yeah, I mean, overall, you just really try to be kind to people. Don't let people walk all over you if they're being really super obnoxious. Everybody has a bad day. They can say things. I work with the public in my volunteer, and I've worked with students, and I'll simply say, I can tell you're really having a bad day, but I don't really have it coming. So that tends to take it down a notch, and just say, I'll help you every way I can. Okay. But let's work together on this. Okay. I'm not the enemy. And I will say that right out there. Yeah. So just try to be kind to yourself, be kind to other people, but work for justice, fight for justice, because we've got quite a battle on our hands. It's just, yeah. When you've got laws on the books, and you show them to, the authorities, and they say things like, well, we're the state, we can decide what laws we want to enforce. Well, excuse me, comrade. This is not okay. This is just not. I have my basic human rights. Okay, never mind what country I'm from. I have my basic human rights, and you know what? You're not God on earth, and this is a law that's being broken. If it were being broken against you, you'd get the laws enforced. I mean, we've actually had those conversations with those pompous authorities who are abusing their power. Yeah, so keep fighting.
Great way to end the broadcast. Thank you so much, Paulette. This was so eye-opening, and I think that there's a lot of great value you had at the end there for moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. I hope this really helps your listeners.
Thanks.